Thursday night, Daniel stayed until 9 p.m. and saved the firm from a $40,000 error nobody else had caught. Friday afternoon, his team went to happy hour and didn't tell him. Not out of malice, that's almost worse. They just didn't think of him. So Daniel drove to the bar anyway, sat in the parking lot, engine off. Through the window, he could see them laughing. Priya mid-story, Greg doing that performed laugh. The new hire 3 weeks in, already inside the circle. Daniel's phone stayed silent, and sitting there in the dark, he finally asked himself the question he'd been avoiding for 4 years. If I disappeared tomorrow, would any of them even notice? Stay until the end, because what Daniel builds, while nobody is watching, is the part of this story that changes everything. The answer came back quiet, and it changed everything. Daniel Reeves, 28, junior data analyst at a mid-sized logistics firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. He had a way of sitting at his desk that made him look like he'd always been there, shoulders slightly forward, eyes on the screen, coffee going cold beside the keyboard. The kind of stillness that reads as furniture. He wasn't someone who needed applause. He'd grown up in a house where you showed up, did the work, and let the results speak. The problem was, results don't speak. People speak for them, and Daniel had never learned that language. His office ran on visibility. Promotions went to the most present, the loudest, the ones who made themselves feel inevitable. Daniel had been passed over once already. The job went to Marcus, who wore better shoes and once called pivot tables those spreadsheet things. Daniel had trained Marcus on pivot tables 8 months earlier. He said nothing. He told himself next time. He'd noticed one person in the building who didn't perform, Sandra, VP of Operations. She asked questions nobody else thought to ask, the kind that cut to what was actually broken. Everyone else performed for Sandra. Sandra just looked for what was true. Next time came and went. 3 desks from a window he never looked out of. Lunch at his desk because nobody asked. Work that kept the department running with his name on none of it. Invisible. If you've ever been the most reliable person in the room and still felt like the least important one, if you've ever done the work, swallowed the silence, told yourself next time while watching next time pass, you don't just understand Daniel. You are Daniel. Hit subscribe if you've ever felt invisible in a room you were holding together. Every story on this channel is made for you. Now, back to Daniel. A team meeting. Daniel had built a projection model for a client pitch. He walked the room through it. Silence. Greg nodded, that nod that means nothing, and said, "Let's hear from someone with more client-facing experience." 12 minutes later, Priya summarized Daniel's model in different words. The room responded. Greg said, "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need." Daniel stared at his notebook. He wrote nothing in it. 2 months later, performance review. Meets expectations. Notes. Daniel is a reliable contributor, like furniture, present, functional, unremarkable. He asked what it would take to reach senior analyst. Greg said, "We need people who can really own the room, just work on being more out there." Daniel drove home, sat on the edge of his bed. Be more out there. A way of saying, become someone else. And sitting there, he felt something unexpected. Not anger, relief. He could finally see it. There was no version of more out there that would ever be enough for Greg. He'd been auditioning for a role that didn't exist. He opened his nightstand drawer and pulled out a plain notebook. Turned to the first page, uncapped a pen. 3 words. Stop asking them. He underlined it, closed the notebook, and the next morning, he stopped waiting to be seen and started deciding what to build. He found Claire, a supply chain consultant, through an industry forum. She said, "You keep performing for an audience that's already left the building. Stop trying to get promoted by people who don't understand your value, and start building something for the ones who will." He didn't write it down. He didn't need to. Then came the Friday that broke something open. Quarterly close. Daniel had caught a discrepancy that would have corrupted the firm's inventory numbers for the entire reporting cycle. Found it at 6 p.m., stayed until 9 to fix it, filed a clean report by morning. Nobody knew. At 4 p.m. Friday, he looked up. The office was empty. Happy hour. A group chat he wasn't in. He drove the 2 blocks anyway. He didn't go in. Sat in the parking lot, Engine off. Watch them through the window. Phone silent. And for the first time in 4 years, he was honest with himself. I kept showing up, hoping they would notice. They never were going to. And quieter, underneath that, the thing he'd never let himself say. I kept showing up because some part of me believed I had to earn the right to be included. That the work would eventually be enough. That I would eventually be enough. He started the car, drove home, and didn't look back at the window. What did you tell yourself the last time you kept showing up for people who weren't showing up for you? That it would get better, that they'd come around, that if you just did a little more, proved a little more, they'd finally see it. Most of us have been there. The question is, how long did it take you to stop? Drop your answer in the comments, and if someone you care about is still sitting in that parking lot, send this to them. Right now. Daniel went quiet. Not the quiet of giving up, the quiet of someone who has finally decided where to aim. The inventory reconciliation process had been bleeding the firm $40,000 a quarter. He'd been patching the aftermath invisibly for 2 years. He decided to stop patching and start replacing. 3 months, 5:30 every morning. An automated model. Clean, documented, scalable, stress-tested against 18 months of data. He told no one. At work. Quiet. Thorough. Forgettable. One Tuesday night in March, it was done. He sent it directly to Sandra. 2 paragraphs, no apologies, no qualifiers. Problem, solution, projected savings. Closed his laptop. Waited. Day 1. Nothing. Day 2. Nothing. He made peace with the version where she never replied. He just knew that doing nothing guaranteed the other one. Day 3. 11:47 p.m. I'd like to understand this better. Can we find time this week? Daniel read it 4 times, then sat in the quiet of his apartment and let it settle. The meeting, 3 weeks later. Sandra, 3 directors, and Greg, whose name on the invite list made something tighten. Daniel opened the notebook that night, read the 3 words, closed it. He walked them through the model. Calm. Precise. When a director challenged an assumption, Daniel had the validation set ready before the objection finished landing. He watched Greg's face. Greg was very still. Nobody asked Greg anything. The model was adopted company-wide within 60 days. In its first quarter, it saved the firm $40,000 in write-offs that would otherwise have gone undetected. Nobody connected it to the Thursday night Daniel had stayed until 9. Nobody thought to. 6 months later, Sandra introduced Daniel to a supply chain consultancy in Atlanta. They made him an offer within the week. 60% increase, 3 levels up. He gave 2 weeks' notice on a Wednesday, packed his desk, 4 years in a single box. Stood with it a moment, thinking about the Thursday night, the 9 p.m., the $40,000, the clean report. Then picked up the box and walked to the elevator. Priya pulled him aside at the send-off. For what it's worth, I always knew you were the smartest person here. 4 years ago, that would have meant everything. Now he received it like a compliment about a house he'd already moved out of. Warmly, distantly, grateful for the version of himself who would have needed it. Thank you, he said. I know now. 4 years earlier, Daniel sat in a parking lot, staring at that window. On his last day, the people inside stood around him saying how much they'd miss him, and Daniel received it kindly, warmly, from a very great distance, because he wasn't looking through any windows anymore. The parking lot wasn't the low point. The parking lot was the turning point. That's where Daniel stopped believing that if he worked harder, stayed later, built better. Eventually, they'd see it. They were never going to see it. Not because he wasn't good enough, because they were looking for something else entirely. And the moment he understood that, the straining stopped. Everything he'd been spending on the wrong audience became available for the right one. Daniel didn't win when Sandra replied. Daniel didn't win when Atlanta called. Daniel won the night he opened that notebook, wrote 3 words, and underlined them. Stop asking them. So if you're in that office right now, stop spending your fire on the wrong audience. Go quiet. Go deep. Build the thing they'll never understand, and take it directly to the people who will. They exist. They're looking. And when they find you, they will know immediately, completely, without a single word of explanation, exactly what they're looking at. My name is Nav, and this has been a story to help you navigate your life.